Welcome back to our monthly Tango Alpha Lima Be the One podcast. I'm your host, Amy Forsyth, and I'll be here on the first of each month with guests who provide expertise, resources, and peer-to-peer support as part of the American Legion's Be the One initiative to prevent suicide within the veteran community. Learn more at betheone.org, and let's get today's conversation started. Today, our guest is U.S. Navy veteran, Dr. Ruth Moore, an integrative health practitioner in functional medicine from Ellsworth, Maine. Dr. Moore is a trauma response expert who treats stress-based health conditions and post-traumatic stress disorder with complementary, alternative, and integrative medicine. She's also a published author, a neuroscientist, and clinical aromatherapist who has testified before Congress and played a role in creating health policy that helps her fellow veterans get access to appropriate health care from the VA. So welcome, Dr. Ruth Moore. Thank you so much for joining us here today on Be the One podcast.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Amy.
It's wonderful to talk with you because of your specialties and that you're a fellow Navy veteran. So before we get into your specialties and what you've learned through the years with your practice, tell us about your journey in the Navy. When did you join and what was your specialty while you were serving?
So I joined in '86. It was the dream after I graduated high school. I grew up in a very rural area, very poor, and the Navy was literally my ticket to entering the world and getting educated. I went through boot camp. I went to my A school, and I went to my first duty station in the Azores. And unfortunately, things didn't work the way we had hoped they were. I literally suffered military sexual assault and developed military sexual trauma from two of those commands. And so then I went to Bethesda, Maryland, and cross-trained over before I was discharged from the Navy. And then I struggled for several years. I didn't get the help I needed. And that led to a couple suicide attempts and then a divorce, homelessness, and then getting back on my feet when I started getting the appropriate healthcare through the vet center. And then my therapist says, you have a lot to offer the world. He says, people listen when you talk. So why don't you become a doctor? Why don't you do what you wanted to have done for you, for the veterans who don't have it? And so it seemed like the right idea. And I went back to school. I did my master's degree in neuroscience and behaviorism. And then I went on and worked for a few years, still had difficulties, and then went back to school from the VA Chapter 31 benefits and became a doctor. So it's a long story.
Well, you're the type of person that's literally walked the walk, talked the talk, and here you are today as our special guest expert. And in Be the One podcast, what we're trying to get to and talk with experts and peer-to-peer, resources. And so with your background, who's someone who's experienced that Navy experience, and then the post-traumatic stress, and then your journey through academics, and then having your own practice, let's start with what are some trend lines that you're seeing out there for your patients or your active practice, but for veterans out there who might need some resources? What are some ways that they can get some help?
Well, a lot of times, Amy, our veterans don't like to ask for help. That's the big thing. And sometimes we need to recognize that a veteran is in a place where their neurochemistry might be off balance, or their behaviors might say, one thing, but the reality is another. And so when a veteran is in crisis, or even when a veteran is having difficulties, we encourage them to reach out to the VA if they are service connected. And if not, we encourage them to reach out to their vet centers and their local communities. And the vet centers actually specialize in post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic stress syndrome. And that's actually the first place where I felt comfortable and safe in my own journey. And I find a lot of my veteran patients prefer to connect with the vet center and work with their therapists and their counselors in a neutral environment before they seek care at the VA.
And so if folks are spread out throughout the country, can you talk more about the vet centers and, some resources that you've seen that have been very effective ways of helping people get the referrals or the contacts that they need?
Yeah. So the vet centers are actually the half sibling to the VA or the Veterans Health Administration. They're the second half of it, and they're equally balanced. What's really neat is the vet center records don't go into the VA, but the VA records do go into the vet center. So the therapists have access to a lot of the vet's records and will not release those records to the VA unless the vet gives that permission. The therapists are specifically trained in how to work with post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and the therapist can work not only with the veteran, but also with the veteran's family. And that's a big and critical piece. The VA tends to work only with the veteran. But when you have the vet center and they're working with a husband or a wife who may be a veteran and having challenges, the vet center is going to take a more holistic approach, and they're going to say, well, how is your spouse handling this? And, they'll work with the veteran and the spouse to try to create a bridge of understanding and helping that veteran develop security in the family unit.
Well, through some of your studies you mentioned, I'd like to hear more from you about what are those triggers? What are those things that we can be on the lookout for in ourselves or see it in someone else from a neuroscience perspective? What are the things that we don't know that could help us?
Well, when we look at neuroscience, it's pretty much all your brain chemicals and how they affect your body. And so I'm trying to keep it very simple in layman's terms. Unfortunately, there is a term that does not simplify well, and that's neural-endocrine disorders. And so when we look at veterans when they get out of the service, some of them have some pretty profound health challenges, chronic pain, symptoms of PTSD. They don't sleep well at night. They have problems trusting people. They're always irritable or on edge. Some of them are massively depressed. And all of these go back to our neurochemistry, whether it is what we call DOS, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, or your epinephrine, norepinephrines. There's also GABA and PEA and those big chemicals. They all affect the body, and they all affect how we perceive things. They affect our emotions. Chronic pain, if we're eating the wrong foods and the foods aren't digested properly, it affects the brain chemistry. That affects the stomach, and it goes down what we call the HPA axis. Increases stress levels. We can't get rid of stress if our body is always 1 foot on the brake and 1 foot on the gas pedal. I mean, it's just constantly playing back and forth. So when we work with veterans, we like to do tests to see where their neurochemistry is, where their hormones are. And then we work with them either by behavioral work or supplementation. We refer them out for narrative therapies if they need it or if they choose to do it. But the biggest thing is we look at the 3 reasons why veterans tend to commit suicide. One of them is they're tired. They're constantly frustrated, being in constant pain. They feel like they're an imposition to their friends and family who don't understand. And they feel absolutely useless. They have no sense of value or worth. So when you put these 3 dynamics into place, it becomes a vicious circle. And then when you have your neurochemistry up and down, you're either really jacked or you're really depressed, and there's no happy medium in between. So when we work with veterans, we first like to look at where their levels are. Then we work with them trying to find ways to change their levels without drugs, without medicines, trying to instill healthy habits and things that they can do. We change their diets. Believe it or not, the number one problem that we have in the American diet that veterans are really, really prone to are carbohydrate addictions. And if we can take a lot of the big carbohydrates out, whether it be grains or sugars, Then we see one, a weight loss, the chronic pain goes away, and the neurochemistry balances out, and they see things better. So it's not an easy or fast fix, but if we have a veteran who's committed, it makes a big difference. Now, here's the wild card. I was actually 100 pounds heavier 2.5 years ago when I was in med school. And when I took off all the grain, and I took off all the sugar out of my diet, the weight came off immediately. I stopped having non-epileptic seizures, and I was able to balance my emotions and my behaviors out when I was in med school. And then all of a sudden, everything fell into place. And that was really the light bulb that changed my whole direction from being a doctor to becoming, the big word is psychoneuroimmunologist, or doctor of mind-body medicine.
Wow. So it's just a testament to how the body and the mind are so interconnected. What are some other trend lines you're seeing with veterans, especially, who are seeking help and then they don't have any explanation? Or, what are some success stories that you're seeing? You mentioned the diet. Are there other things such as lifestyle or exercise or learning, reading, maybe some other things some tools that you've found some success with?
Well, this is a loaded question, Amy, but it's a really easy answer. In 2015, the VA was really fairly resistant to complementary, alternative, and integrative medicine. They started changing and allowing veterans to have complementary services like massage therapy and chiropractic medicine. And then in 2017, the VA actually passed Directive 1179 or 1159. I'm not sure the numbers, but that was a mandate to go ahead and start exploring complementary health and medicine through select VA facilities across the country. And when we started looking at that, some VAs would use it, some VAs wouldn't. But then when I was in school at Saybrook, I decided, well, my dissertation is going to be how to help veterans access complementary care. And so my dissertation was literally on which complementary methods worked incredibly well. The VA has a list of 3 different medicines: List A, List B, and List C. List A are the complementary medicines that are peer-reviewed within the VA to be most effective. That is massage therapy, that is acupuncture, that is chiropractic medicine. List B might be things that some VAs will do, like Qigong and meditation. And then List C are experimental therapies the VA hasn't studied, but the National Institute of Health has. The VA and the National Institute of Health are 2 separate entities. So things like light therapy, biophotonic therapy, cymatic therapy, sound therapy, color therapies. And so the VA doesn't authorize the level C's or the C type of therapies. This is what I explored. I explored the B and the C therapies to see if we could expand the available therapies for our veterans. Sometimes it is exercise related. So if you have a morbidly obese veteran, when you start changing their diet, they need to start working out in order to get those hormones working right. And so what we do, we have quite a few success stories. And so when I start working with a veteran, once we do the testing, then I ask the veteran, what do you want? Be honest with me. What do you want? And usually I get, doc, I just don't want to be in pain anymore. Or doc, I just don't want to feel like crap anymore. And so we say, okay, well, here's what we're going to recommend we do. Once they start losing weight by dietary changes, when someone is morbidly obese, you can't have them go work out in a gym. It's going to set them up for failure. They're not going to want to be in front of other people. They're not going to want to do the weights and stuff. So we try to work with them in non-weight bearing exercises. We have an incredible relationship with a private entity here that has a pool. So I put my veterans in the pool and we start working on range of motion and we start working on water weights. Then once they develop the strength, they start losing weight, they develop the self-confidence, Then we put them into more structured activities with private trainers. And then you have other things. So biophotonic therapy is light therapy, red light therapies. The VA has done some testing with red light therapy for chronic pain. They've worked with blue light therapy to change neurochemistry, and it works incredibly well. And then they use far infrared therapy, and that's for chronic pain deep in the joints or within the organs. And there is considerable research to back this, but a lot of the VAs don't have the units available. So we're trying to find resources through my clinic for veterans that are affordable for the veterans to do, and maybe the VA will add them into their medical supportive services so that the veterans can have these issues or these products issued. Sound therapy. So we have the veterans, some have access in the VA facilities to acupuncture. Some veterans don't like needles. Some veterans are terrified of needles. I have this really, really big guy in my practice. And when he talks about needles, he goes pale. And I'm like, oh my goodness, let's just talk about something else. So what we did was we looked back in my dissertation and my doctoral work, and we found a way to do needle-free acupuncture using sound waves and using crystal matrices. So we put a stone on the skin that has a point right over the acupressure point that an acupuncturist would use. And then we introduce a specific frequency through that stone, and it goes straight into the body and has the same effect as a needle in acupuncture, but it doesn't break the skin. There's no permanent, marks or anything, and there is almost instant relief when we do that. So I'm training all of my staff on how to use the sound waves and the stones to go ahead and induce those currents into the body. So, and then there's, you have a good physiologist or you have physical therapists. They can help a veteran as well. The VA uses them. That's part of the standard VA regimen, but they don't use them to the fullest capacity. There's a new wave of practitioner called a chiropractic neurologist, and they work really well with vestibular health, or how the head and the brain work and balance. And a lot of times I just had a veteran who was a Marine or is a Marine, and he suffered head injuries in the service, and he didn't believe he suffered head injuries. And when I did the simple nystagmus test, he was failing it. It was abysmal. And I said, were you ever treated for head injuries? He says, no, but I was used in the physical training to do boxing. And I said, yes. And that caused some traumatic brain injuries. And so we're starting to do some vestibular work with him and help him find the resources he needs in the community. We actually live 3.5 hours from our local VA. So it's, not possible for our veterans to travel that far. We do have community-based outpatient clinics, but in Maine, we're very lucky. We're very fortunate because the VA system recognizes that, and they authorize fee services so our local providers can provide care to veterans as well.
Well, it sounds amazing. A lot of this stuff people haven't really heard yet or haven't adopted in a mainstream medical sense. Folks, we're talking with Dr. Ruth Moore, an integrative health practitioner, an expert in complementary, alternative, and integrative medicine. With all your years of expertise in seeing our veterans, and you've seen it all, and you've come up with some really great pathways to healing those ailments of our veterans. Can you talk to us about the strides made in the VA? You've testified before Congress about this, and trying to help guide the VA, and talk to us about some of the things you've seen with the VA, and then where are we going in the future, and progress and modernization with the VA?
Absolutely. So in 2015, Secretary McDonald actually commissioned our nonprofit Eternity to go across the country and tour 19 different VA facilities. And what we were looking at were patient access, specifically how women veterans were gaining access to care and what the difference was between Vietnam, Cold War to post 9/11 veterans. We wanted to see where the disparities of care were coming. What we learned is there are 1,700 VA facilities broken down into 21 active care VISNs. And so each VISN is autonomous. And so,
Dr. Moore, what's the VISN stand for? VISN.
yeah, Veterans Integrative Service Networks. And so in each VISN, you have 2 to 3 major hospitals, several community-based outpatient clinics, and many, many, many providers. And what we found is that the providers and the VISNs themselves were actually quite good. So we also found that some facilities were really great and some were in some substantial need of improvement. There's no easy way to say that. But what we found was the heart and the intent from many of the practitioners was 100% spot on to help our veterans. And so complementary medicine was not well embraced in the beginning. But then we saw some really nice strides, like Topeka, Kansas has an equine therapy program. That was fantastic. Let's see, Clarksburg, West Virginia, they have a musical program where they do guitar classes for the veterans. Indiana, they have an art therapy program. So many different facilities are starting to embrace these auxiliary types of programs and complementary healthcare that works on creativity, works on self-esteem. These are all parts of the puzzle that are starting to fit together to provide wraparound comprehensive care. The one thing that the facilities aren't embracing are the neural-endocrine testing, specifically to look at the different neurotransmitters in the brain. And the reason why they're not doing that is because they work with specific laboratories and specific testing companies, and they have to do a purchase order system. So that slowly changes when the veterans ask for help or ask for specific tests or ask to be moved to the outside for fee-based care. So we're seeing some great changes. The VA some are overwhelmed, chronically overwhelmed, and they just have so many providers that have got to meet certain productivity quotas. And it's very frustrating to everyone, including the veterans who, they feel like they're lost in the system or they're not getting the care. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of prescription medications, psychopharmaceutical medications to help with anxiety and depression and all of that, because it's clinical, it's allopathic medicine. But when we start adding in the complementary modalities and we start seeing our veterans responding to them, we're starting to see a trend for veterans to embrace more complementary and self-care methods. The biggest shift is veterans were basically going and working with the VA. Their doctor was an authority figure and they did what their doctor said. Now we're seeing veterans who are saying, wait a minute, I don't want to take all those medicines. What else is there? And then we're starting to see providers who are looking at the National Institute of Health databases and they're saying, oh, well, yeah, we do have some of these options available. And when we can start using more drug-free therapies, we're starting to create a sense of independence and even empowerment with our veterans to get the care that they want and need. How does this work with veteran suicide and, reducing that suicide ideation? Well, we need to keep our veterans busy. We need to keep them active. And we need them to have a sense of fulfillment or purpose. We also need veterans to have that sense of empowerment. So if they're not feeling well, they can say, I don't feel well today. One of my favorites that I use is, I'm not peopling well today. And, that's perfectly fine to say. I'm just, I'm not really social today. My social batteries have run out. And that's perfectly fine to say. And letting veterans have the confidence to say that rather than trying to please or live up to everyone's expectations. Then the big thing is changing the diet. Most of if you remember, or I don't know if you've been in the service, Amy, but when we went through military training, it was you have 5 minutes to eat that fine pine Navy chow. And you had a high carb diet with lots of additives and preservatives. And that's how we got through boot camp. We ate a lot of high carb, high starchy foods. And that's where our body was going. But it also changed our brain with all the stress of, basic military reintegration and training. So you have your stress levels high, you have your carb levels high. It creates something called glucose addiction, sugar addiction. And then when you get out of the service, what do? Well, all that sugar is wreaking havoc in your body, and it's creating pain in your body. Studies are showing that sugar addiction and carb addictions are literally causing symptoms related to autoimmune disorders. And so when we start taking out the sugars and the carbs, we start eating whole unprocessed foods, then we're starting to see a reduction in the chronic pain. So we're keeping our veterans busy. We're reducing the chronic pain. We're giving them a sense of purpose, and then they don't feel like the imposition to their family. The biggest thing is when a veteran feels like they're an imposition, they've given up. They're not going to ask for help. And that's the big piece that we need to bring in. We need to make broad changes. We're doing it. It's slower, but we need to make those broad changes so that our veterans benefit.
Well, so true, and so many threads there. Would you say that, are you seeing your patients or some themes there that are they reluctant to change their diet, or is that one step that they can manage and take to see some actual benefits? And then if they make that small stride, they can take the next step to better health, or if they see some good progress, they're more likely to continue on that path?
That's a loaded question. I deal with patients who are chronically obese, morbidly obese, but I also deal with patients who are incredibly malnourished and their digestive systems have shut down. Literally, I had a veteran who is morbidly obese, and in a matter of 6 weeks, he's lost about 45 pounds. And so he's a Vietnam era veteran. I'm not going to tell a Vietnam era veteran, you can't have that piece of pie. I mean, dude, you served in a war, and you served in rice paddies, and it just was not a pleasant place. You've lived some horrible things in your life. If you want that piece of pie, have that piece of pie. But I'm going to say, your diabetes, your sugar might not like it. So instead of having that piece of pie, have that piece of pie. Have that smaller dose. Don't deny yourself, just eat it more in moderation. And then we work with them. I asked him, I said, where do you want to be? He's like, well, doc, I don't want to get up every morning and hurt like hell. And he said, okay, let's work with you. And so he goes to the VA. He works with people at the VA. And surprisingly, he went through the MOVE program, or the VA's weight loss reduction program, 3 times. And he's not getting the benefit that he wanted because he doesn't have, they give a wonderful book, they give resources, they give classes, but a veteran has to have motivation. And I said, what's your motivation? He's like, I don't want my wife to be a widow. I was like, well, that's a pretty good motivation. I said, so what do you want to do about it? He says, well, doc, that's why I'm coming to you. What do you suggest? I said, well, are you really ready to make the change, or are you going to call me a meanie again? And he says, no, I'm ready, doc. And so it was kind of funny. The same vet, his wife comes in on some of the appointments, and she says, doc, I can't give up my chocolate. I was like, okay, well, I can't help you if you're not willing to give up your chocolate, but here's what will happen over time. She came in 2 weeks ago. She says, doc, I ate my chocolate. You were a meanie. I didn't think you knew what the hell you were talking about. I was like, okay. I said, what happened? She says, I hurt for 3 days afterwards. And she's like, doc, I gave up my chocolate. I said, well, now that you've given up your chocolate, here's my favorite recipe for chocolate, but it's using cacao instead of chocolate. And she's like, okay. So when they're ready to make a step forward, we're going to meet them. We're going to be with them. We're going to make that step with them. When they start regressing or falling back, we're going to hold space for them until they realize, okay, I got to get back on track, because if I don't. And so when we find our veterans are invested in their healthcare, when they start to see progress, when they start to feel progress, Amy, that's what really is the motivator. I had another veteran, Army veteran, come in. He was a helicopter pilot, and he suffered some pretty substantial injuries when his helicopter crashed. He goes to the VA, he gets his care, but he comes to me, he says, Doc, I can't handle it anymore. People look at me. I mean, I'm young, I'm healthy, and I'm disabled, and I shouldn't be. I said, well, how does that make you feel? He says, I don't even want to go there. I said, okay, so what can you do about it? He says, well, I'd really like it if my arm didn't hurt so much all the time. Okay. And so we started doing some somatic therapy. We traced the nerves down, and I said, flex your fingers, do this, do that. And we found out where the cause of his pain was, which the VA had done. But instead of giving him exercises and working with him, they gave him medication. He says, I don't want to take pills. I have a child. So we started giving him some exercises. And actually, I met with him right before I came in today to this meeting. And he says, Doc, you know, those exercises work. My arm hasn't hurt in 2 weeks. Yeah, this is the type of work that we're doing. And when our veterans have a focus, and we really pull in that drive and that, you know, that focus that they have, their military training, we're using that training. They're using it for themselves instead of to help a unit. They're using it to help themselves. And all of a sudden, they're not in imposition. They're not in chronic pain, and they feel like they have value again.
Well, it's showing just the power of your story too for your patients, of giving them that inspiration that they need to cut out the sugar or do the exercises. You mentioned that some of them are being issued meds, and can you talk to us about the balance between using meds as opposed to an alternative or integrative therapies, and when to know the difference in terms of how to treat themselves, and when to get help for that?
Absolutely. So we're not anti-med. In my practice, I have a nurse practitioner, and if we feel a patient needs a medication, we will write a medication for them. But a lot of times what we try to do is we ask them, we get a list of medications that the patients are taking, and then we start looking to see, is there a natural version of this medication rather than this medication? St. John's wort is a perfect example. So if you have an antidepressant, St. John's wort is a natural antidepressant. Lemon balm is a natural antidepressant. So we ask them, you know, what do you want? Then we work integratively with their practitioner, and we say, okay, your patient wants to take and taper off this medication. Can we start substituting the natural herbs for the medications, doing a natural approach? There's many reasons for that, but the simplest reason is most of the medications that are given out by the VA or any doctor's office, they have a very large molecular structure. And the brain and the body do not absorb that because the molecules can't pass what we call the blood-brain barrier. If you use a natural medication, it can pass the blood-brain barrier and have the same effect or better, and it's natural rather than synthetic. So what we try to do is we try to get our veterans over to as many natural resources as possible. We try to, based on the work of Dr. Jack Cruz, we try to increase their exposure to ambient light, whether it be outside, vitamin D production, or inside using sun lamps. We try to increase the natural light production for them because it works with their brain chemistry. Then we start looking at the medication's effects in the body. And sometimes a medication will have a side effect, and then you are medicated for the side effect as well. So we try to go ahead and look at the patient and the cause of the problem. That's the functional medicine approach. Rather than looking at the symptom, we look at the cause. And then we kind of follow that ladder down to find where they're at now. We try to substitute out the things that will work for the patient. We involve the doctor as part of a therapeutic team. And then we go ahead and we start to work with the veteran and the doctor to make sure that the changes are effective. I have veterans who are taking thyroid medications. They don't want to be taking thyroid medications. There are alternatives, but they're not well known. So we try to research and find what's best. And then we talk to their doctor and say, if you taper their medicine down by 5 micrograms or whatever, we're going to go ahead and start adding this. And then that requires that the patient have monthly blood level checks to make sure that everything's working. A real good one. And I have to go nerd on this one. A lot of veterans are being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Adult onset type 2 diabetes. Again, it's that sugar and carb addiction. But the number one medication is metformin. And a lot of patients don't like the feeling that metformin has in their bodies. How many people know that there are natural alternatives? And one of them is a good old southern plant called okra. It's horrible. It's nasty. I hate it. But research is proven that if people are starting to go ahead and ingest okra in certain ways, it lowers their blood sugar enough and they don't have to take metformin. If we can get those veterans to lose X amount of pounds, increase their metabolism and work, as well as using the okra derivatives, and then all of a sudden they don't need medications anymore. Their type 2 diabetes is now controllable and it's not active diabetes. So these are the things that we're doing. But again, that changes the blood chemistry in a person. It changes the neurochemistry in a person. And it all goes back to understanding neuroscience. And many of my colleagues, doctors, physicians, don't have a lot of neuroscience training. They don't have a lot of dietary training. That's why we have dietitians and we have nutritionists. I kind of fall in between both. And I find that, if we can educate our colleagues and educate our doctors about nutritional options, it makes a big difference. And we're starting to see doctors don't want new information unless it's peer reviewed. If you can show them studies and it's peer reviewed, they will consider it. If you don't, they're not going to. So we provide through our clinic and working with our veterans, we always provide the research studies that support what we're recommending.
Well, Dr. Ruth Moore, you are pretty much close to a miracle worker with all your success stories. And what would be the thing that you'd like to share with folks about the element of suicide, and when people are at the edge and on the verge and just don't see any other way? What's your first step that you take when you see people are at the brink to take such a drastic step? Where do you go from there?
The VA actually has a lot of resources about veteran suicide. But it's kind of like you have a dartboard and you have all these holes and all the dots are there, but they're not connected. And that's the big piece. And that's where we as Legionnaires and we as veterans can hold places or hold our brothers or our sisters sick. So when we're working with veterans, if we have someone who's close to us, they seem depressed, they seem quiet, they're always grouchy, they're always in chronic pain. The first step that we can do is we can be the one, we can be a friend. And we can say, hey, it looks like you're having a rough time today. What's going on? I don't want to talk about it. Or I'm fine. Fine. When I'm fine, I'm looking at them and saying, okay, how are you really feeling now? Because everybody says they're fine. And I will be the short little 5'1" person who is going to dog them until they tell me what's really the matter. But so we can be there for our veterans and we can ask them what's the matter and we can support them. A lot of times being a friend is a big thing. Veterans are not going to ask for help, and many veterans are not going to tell you they're going to go out and commit suicide. Okay. When I was in the service and I had tried, I didn't tell anybody I was going to commit suicide. I did what I did and I didn't show up to muster the next morning, and they sent someone to my quarters and found me. I didn't tell anybody I was going to do it. And it really didn't, I honestly thought it was going to be a lot better if I did commit suicide, because then my mom and my dad wouldn't be ashamed of me. And then I wouldn't be stigmatized. I wouldn't be asked one more time, well, what were you wearing when you were raped? I was wearing my military uniform. So I'm not going to go too deep into that. But what I will say is, I didn't feel like anybody cared. Everybody was always blaming it on me. I did contract some STDs. And so I was then branded, a not so desirable word. And so had I had the help when I needed it, probably wouldn't have gotten to that point, then I wouldn't be here. But recognizing that someone's in pain, if they're not going to give you the truth, they're going to give you one word answers, or they're going to try to deflect it. And when they try to deflect it, that in itself is a big key. The VA has indices of suicide veterans. They're going to go ahead and they're going to give away their things. They're going to go ahead and do this, and they're going to go ahead and do that. Not everybody has those symptoms. So being the one is actively getting asked someone something, what's the matter? Another thing that we can do is I can say, well, I'll make up a name. I'll say, hey, Kathy, I'm going to go shopping today. Why don't you come with me? I really just don't feel like I'm peopling well today. Will you come with me and, just help me get out? Going for walks. We put our lives on the line for this country. And we have so many beautiful national parks. Most veterans don't realize they get a free national park pass. And going for a hike or a walk, or just going for a drive through some of the parks, it's beautiful. And it gets us out in the light again. Having someone feel needed. So, I could say, hey, George, I've got this project going on. I don't know how to do this. I truly don't know how to take and do computers. Can you come help me do this for a little while? Make someone feel needed. And then, I see someone on, I said, looks like your hand's really bothering you today. What are you doing for it? Well, I can't do anything. I took the medications, the doctors and helped me. I said, look, come here. Let me see this. Try rubbing it this way. Try doing this. And when we listen to someone, we have to listen with our eyes. We don't listen with our ears. We have to listen with our heart. We don't listen with our ears. We listen with our eyes and our heart, and then our gut instinct says, something's wrong here. You need to take and do more. And that's really how we can be the one. Our legions all across the country have so many different active events. And then for a couple of days a week, these halls are empty. Well, why don't we get our legions actively involved in doing more, feel good things for our veterans? I mean, have an exercise class there, have your local community people volunteer. I was just asked if I would volunteer for a 3-day hiking and hunting event for some of the veterans through another organization. So if we had these types of things, if we used our Legion spaces and we had exercise classes and we had get-togethers, sit down and have a coffee, or sit down, show a movie. Wow, how many veterans would love to be able to watch a movie in their VFW or their Legion? Wow, wouldn't that be cool? So we can be the one. We can do so many things. We just have to think outside of Schrodinger's box. Just have to go a little bit outside the box.
Well, wonderful tips. Dr. Ruth Moore, it's been a real pleasure talking with you today. You're just such a kind-hearted woman who you spent your entire life to help veterans, and you've made so much progress and really been influential and made such a big impact. Before we go, what other final thoughts would you have, and what would you like people to remember here for Be the One you've mentioned before, but share with us your final thoughts.
I think I have two. The first is veterans, we are take charge kind of people. No one likes to admit they need help. So for a veteran to ask for help, it's very hard. But I want our veterans out there to know that it's okay to ask for help, because sometimes when you ask someone for help, you're giving them the blessing of letting them help you. And so by asking for help, you're giving someone the blessing of helping you, and you might be helping them in the same way. Another piece is a lot of veterans don't have resiliency. We're black and white, no shades of gray type of people. I did write a book on resiliency, and is it a shameless plug? Perhaps. But it's the idea of developing resiliency in 32 days. And that was based on a poem by Rudyard Kipling, If. And that was really what got me through the rough times. And so I would recommend, if you can't afford the book, go to a library and check it out. It's called Building Resiliency, 32 Days to a Better You. And any veteran who does that book, they can send me an email through downieswellness.com or downieswellness@gmail.com. And I am more than happy to meet with them 4 times online at no charge to say, hey, how did you get through this chapter? How did you get through that chapter? What were your takeaways? I see veterans for free on Mondays. Any veteran can come in for a consultation on Mondays with me, and we'll put them in the right direction. The other thing is there are so many resources out there, and there is not a lot of trust. Who's right? Who's wrong? Doc said this, doc said that. So what I would recommend is if people have questions that are unbiased questions, they're going to get unbiased answers if they reach out to us at downieswellness@gmail.com. We're going to find the answers. If we don't have the answers, we'll find the answers for our veterans because they deserve that. When I went through boot camp, we were all promised, if you get hurt in the line of service for your country, we're going to make sure that you have the resources. Some veterans are having that access. Some veterans aren't experiencing that. So we're going to bridge the gap. The VA gave me the opportunity to go back to school and become a doctor. And it was with the promise that if I could do this, I would help our veterans. And that's what we're doing here in Maine. So those are my 2 big takeaways. Maybe it's sounding, a little bit wishy-washy or humanistic, but it really is what saved my life.
Well, what a wonderful story. And it's very generous of you now to give back. And thank you so much for being our special guest here today on Be the One podcast. And for our listeners out there, we're going to put everything in the show notes, but where is it that they can find you and connect with you? What's your website?
downieswellness.com.
Okay, we'll list that and some other of your favorite resources as well. And thank you, Alphas, for tuning into the Tango Alpha Lima Be the One podcast. Remember, you can be the one to save one veteran. Find resources and more information on betheone.org and connect with the American Legion on social media to keep the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe to the Tango Alpha Lima podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. And please share this podcast with others. And we'll see you on the next edition of Be the One podcast. Thank you so much.
On the first day of every month, American Legion family members are encouraged to wear Be the One apparel to publicly show their commitment to reducing the stigma around mental health issues. Go to betheone.org to learn how you can be the one to save one veteran. If you're a veteran in crisis or concerned about one, call the Veterans Crisis Line at 988 and press 1. You're not alone. The Veterans Crisis Line is here for you, and you don't have to be enrolled in the VA. Help is available, and speak with someone today.